G'day everyone. This tutorial is to look at how we can get the font files used on the DJI WTFOS hack to be living on the goggles and not the SD card. This will allow you to reformat the SD card in the goggles, etc., without impacting how the goggles OSD works. It also allows you to try out new fonts by putting them on the SD card. And using those. So let's get going. Apologize for any audio muffled here. I don't really have a good audio setup, or a microphone, so hopefully you can understand what I'm saying. So when we look at how the goggles decide what precedence to use for where the files are located, it's essentially what we're seeing here on the screen in terms of how it decides. So assuming you've got a VTX connected to a flight controller and the UARTs are set up correctly and you're sending correct MSP DisplayPort messages through to the VTX and therefore on through to the goggles, and the firmware itself is a valid and supported firmware for OSD display, being iNav, rdupilot, Betaflight, Kiss Ultra. I think they're the four main ones at the moment. And it receives that firmware identifier, and the font files are contained on the SD card with the right naming convention that includes the flight controller firmware ID, such as font_inav, etc. Then it will use the font contained on the SD card, regardless of any other fonts that are located anywhere else. The second thing it does is, if it can't find them on the SD card, it looks into the file system on the goggles to grab the font files. They're in a specific location on the goggles, and that's the purpose of this tutorial, is to move those files to this location, so that if the files on the SD card are absent, it will then revert to what's on the goggles themselves. If there's no valid firmware ID, and you might find that with some of the KISS stuff, etc., then it will use potentially fall back to the standard font file naming convention, and if it exists on the SD card, it will use the one on the SD card. If it's not, it will use the embedded in the goggles font file for displaying that OSD, I think. Maybe wrong here, but this is definitely, if it's not finding on the SD card, it will go to the embedded for anything for the firmware ID that is understood for WTFOS. The other thing it will do is use the embedded font file for displaying the messages that are on the screen as you're starting up the goggles. It doesn't know the SD card at that point has font files, and it doesn't necessarily go and load them, so it will grab the internal ones that are embedded on the goggles, and that'll be the standard font, the standard format of fonts.bin and fonts2.bin, _2.bin, etc., without the embedded firmware ID. So now we've got that underway or looked at, let's move across to how we actually go about doing this. So what the first thing we'll do is we will go to our C drive, and in our Windows temp directory, we will store our font files, and we'll also be installing some other software that help us connect to the goggles to help us move the files around. So there'll be a link in the description for our tools called ADB that allow us to interact with the environment on the goggles directly through a USB port on our computer. This is done on Windows. Not sure how this will work on Mac, so your mileage may vary. This tutorial will cover both doing it through directly through Windows and using command prompt, etc., and also show you how to do it through the WSL that you may have seen in previous tutorials. Either is fine. There's little differences between the two in how you structure the commands, etc., at least what I've found, so just take it how you want to use it. Okay, so when we have our C drive and we go to our temp directory, we will have an empty temp directory, or you may have other things in it, doesn't really matter. But you'll download the platform tools, which is essentially the ADB command set, and you'll extract it. What I'll do is I will delete this so you can just see the process. No, I can't delete it. Anyway, so under here is platform tools, and that is just residing on the C temp directory. So the first thing that we are going to do is, after extracting that out, we can come in here, and what we want to do is go to a Windows command prompt for that directory. For in Windows temp, and we will do I'll bring this up for you guys to see. What we'll do here is we'll set a temporary path command so that when we execute these commands, it doesn't matter which directory we're in, because we need to move around to different directories. So to do that, it is just simply typing set and path equals %path % semicolon C /temp / what's the directory called? It's called platform-tools. And that is it. So when we look at our set command, we can see that the path now should include, at the end of the statement, the path that we've just added, so that when we go to our platform tools, and anything we execute out of here will be accessible by not needing to be in this directory. Okay, so let's jump back in here, and we can run ADB, and you'll see that there's you'll get the help file with that by just executing without any command helpers. First thing we want to do is to back up the current font files on the goggles, and doing that we will need to connect to the goggles. So the goggles need to be powered on and connected via a USB cable to your computer, and then we want to connect to the goggles. So to connect to the goggles, it is simply an ADB connect, if I can type, 192.168.42.5. This will be the same for every single person that runs this. It doesn't matter. It's just where the ADB location is for the goggles. Can't explain it any more than that. I just know that it works. And this will be 168, 192.168, 42.5, and I connect. I'm already connected because I've been playing around with this in the background, but I can disconnect to show you. So it's disconnected and I connected, and now I'm connected. So the computer knows it has a connection to the goggles, and then we can start executing some commands. So the first thing we want to do is to make a backup of the files, the font files, and they're located on the goggles under this location here. And we're going to put them in what will be the temp directory, and you'll see them pop up under here as a fonts backup. It'll automatically create a directory when we rerun this command. I'll kick that off. It's downloading the 18 font files that exist in that location, and it's put them into the fonts backup. So if we need to restore them later, we can, if there are any problems. Okay, so now that we've done that, we can start to look at what font files we want to put on the goggles, and that's pretty easy. I've pre-downloaded 2 different font files, one for Odoo, one for iNav, the ones that I've created. So it's a matter of extracting those into, or creating a fonts directory and extracting both of the contents of that directly into the fonts directory in there. So before I start that process, what I want to show you is how this will work in terms of the order of precedence where things live, just to show you also that well, I can tell you that there isn't a SD card in my goggles, so the goggles themselves will be fine without the SD card. And if I turn my little camera on, and I reboot the goggles, you can see the typical sitting there waiting for the OSD. It goes and searches for the goggles, for the font files, and you can see that it's just sitting there OSD waiting at the moment, without the craft being on, without the VTX being on. So if I now go and push the font files that I've prepared a little bit earlier, it's a green font, so you'll be able to see that the OSD waiting message in the goggles will change to green, which shows you that these are going to be loaded. So I'm going to pop back out of there, come into this window, and I'm going to execute an ADB push command, and I'm telling it to take everything that's in the fonts directory, which is this directory here, and push it up into the goggles fonts directory by doing this. So there are 4 files, and those are the 4 files that lived in here, and they now exist on the goggles. Now the goggles aren't using these font files until it does a restart, so I'm going to enforce a restart on the goggles so that we can see that it now changes to a green font, because the font that I was just loaded on is actually a green colored font. So you can see that the default font that's used when nothing else is connected, the OSD waiting message and other messages specific to WTFOS, are using that font. So What I will do now is just show you how to restore all of the previous files from the fonts backup, which we just made. So back to here, in the fonts backup, there are 18 files in there that will push back into the goggles. So those files have been pushed back up there. I'll trigger a reboot of the goggles and you'll see it's now back to the default, what it was prior to making the changes. Okay, so I'm going to extract these two files in. Actually, before I do that, I'll plug the craft in so you can actually see it using the goggles font that's stored on the goggles, the default one that's all 8-bit looking. So let me plug in, and I'll plug in a little fan on the VTX, so it might get a bit noisy. I've just got some blue tape over the lens. So you'll see it will connect up. It'll find the font file on the goggles, and you can see some elements I've just moved down to the bottom right corner. So this is the standard font file without any high def edges and color in doing that. So what I'm going to do now is extract the WTFOS sphere, and I'm going to put them in the fonts. They live in there, and now if I push what's in the fonts directory up onto the goggles, it's now added the iNav font into the goggles. And if I restart the goggles, or at least the operating system, you can see that it's now picking up on the font file that we've just put into the goggles. Easy as that. You can add other font files. We could add Ardu in on top of that, and if I had a firmware that had Ardu on it, it would throw in, I'd connect up the VTX and Ardu would load, even though all of the font files lived. As long as they're named appropriately with the Ardu or the iNav firmware IDs, it's fine. So that's pretty much how we do it on Windows. There's no SD card in my goggles right now. I can power off the goggles and power them back on. I'll show you that now. Complete power off, powering them back on. Here it is there, and we're back and working. Okay, I will get on to the next section after a short break, and we'll show you how to do it under WSL. Perhaps less interesting to some of you, just because of Windows ease of doing it. All the commands that I'm using I'll put into the description of the video, and you can shift things around to your heart's content. Just be aware that follow the commands as I've put them out. There is, if you're fiddling around with other things on the goggles, there is a danger that you may break something, but certainly doing what I've done there is little to no danger in doing so as long as you're following my instructions. Okay, so the next thing we're going to be looking at is how to use WSL to do the same thing we did on Windows with the ADB toolset with the font files. So we have to first install ADB within our WSL installation, and that process is through this command, and it's simply sudo apt install Android tools ADB. It'll ask you for your root password or your super user password. Okay, so we can see now that it's installed. It's giving us some feedback. So the first thing we want to do is move to our C temp directory. So cd/mnt/sli/temp, and that is the C drive on our Windows installation, C temp drive. So now we want to connect to ADB, connect, and we want to connect to 192.168.42.5, and we are connected. And if we do an ADB devices, you can also see that that device is connected. So we don't have to address it by the IP address anymore. Once we've connected, we just use the ADB command. In the first thing we want to do is take a backup like we did with the Windows side of things. So that'll be ADB pull blackbox WTFOS OPT fonts, and we want to grab everything from the fonts directory, and we want to put it into the directory that we're on at the moment, which is C temp. So we'll start from there, and we'll go to fonts _ backup, and that should be enough. So it's pulling the I don't know, 18 or so different font files that live there, and it's putting them in the fonts backup directory. There all they are there. So we've established we've got a backup of that, which is good. And now we can push fonts to the goggles and see what the goggles are doing with them. So there's no SD card in my goggles at the moment. It's simply using the OSD files that are living on the goggles to present the OSD from WTFOS. So in this fonts directory, I have the iNav fonts that have come from the iNav WTFOS sphere sneaky font file that that I've created. If you didn't realize by now, I'm sneaky FPV. So I've unzipped those and I've put them in the fonts. And the other thing I've done is I've taken these 4 font files, and it's just a duplication of a Betaflight font that I've added some green to, so you can see the effect of what happens and what gets used when the goggles start up. So let's go back to, well, it doesn't really matter on this side of things, but we're on the C drive, we're in the temp folder, that's fine. Now we want to do a push of those files, so it's ADB push for and fonts, and we want to grab all of the font files and we want to push it to the blackbox WTFOS OPT fonts directory. So those 8 files have been pushed over to the goggles, and you can see from the video it's still waiting for a craft to present a video transmitter and information from a flight controller through the video transmitter. We're going to enforce a restart of the goggles, or reboots, sort of like a soft reboot, without actually power cycling. So the command for this, when I find it, I might just have to copy it from elsewhere. No, there it is. I will put this into the description as well. And you'll see that the video's disappeared and it's come back with a green font. So that's showing you that the fonts that live in this directory, it has no flight controller connected, so it's not picking up the iNav fonts. It's picking up these set of fonts. And because I know I've colored them green, this is now showing you a green font. So it's showing you the precedence of what gets picked up when. Okay, so what I'm going to, you've essentially seen how to install the iNav fonts, so I can show you by pairing on Craft. So you'll see that it'll pick up the font files for iNav when it registers as an iNav flight controller. And as you can see, these are not the standard iNav fonts that you get by default. These are the sneaky FPV ones that I have copied over to the goggles. Simple as that. I've just moved some of the on-screen display elements to the bottom right, so you can actually, I can focus on them with the camera, so you can see that they're there presented. So it's really as simple as doing that. I can also copy in any of the other fonts that I want to use if I'm using a Betaflight quad, or if I'm using RGplane, etc. Same process, just copy them to the same directory on the goggles, and the flight controller will tell the goggles which one to use via the MSP messaging that tells it the flight controller's firmware ID. So it's as simple as that. What I'll show you now just quickly is how to restore the defaults onto the goggles from what we've backed up. Sorry, from the goggles onto, oh yes, actually onto the goggles. Just shut down the Craft. Okay, so doing that is simply grabbing going to the WSL and ADB, push, and we're going to push everything that's in the fonts backup directory. Dot meaning everything in there, and then we're going to push it to the blackbox WTFOS OPT fonts directory. So these are the 18 files. It will push back to the goggles, and we can soft restart the goggles, and you can see we're back to the original fonts that we used. Easy as that. We will then just disconnect. Doesn't really matter, I don't think. And then we're done. So you can disconnect your goggles, you can take them out the field without an SD card, or you can put an SD card in there, a fresh one, format them using the goggles menu, and you'll see that the goggles are still displaying the OSD that we've installed. Happy flying!